Hello and welcome to this talk about the data behind the research for constructive development theory. My name is Dr. Darren Stevens, and the numbers behind the principles of the Institute for Adult Development's approach to coaching and vertical development are going to be explained to a higher degree in the next 10 minutes or so. I am not expecting this video to reach many people. I hope you enjoy it though, and if you would like to discuss it, do get in touch. When you start a PhD, you think you know how it's going to go, and you really don't. You have a small idea, but they seldom turn out to be 100% what you planned for. However, a plan is still useful, especially if you are not very procedural in your thinking. I am not procedural, and this had an impact on my writing style. It wasn't academic enough. Please pause the video to read the flow. Once I knew the flow, I was able to drill down into the areas of the literature that were important to my thinking. I then had to determine the types of studies I would use that would investigate the areas of the literature I was hoping to expose as unfulfilled. How do we measure awareness? Is intelligence really the best idea we've got? And where do cognitive intentions fit into all of this? Having made the observation on the master's students and their thinking from a Keegan perspective, and the connection to cognitive intentions, I had to devise a number of studies that would question and tease out levels of awareness. I will walk you through the 5 studies in my thesis, and what some of the technical terms mean regarding data interpretation. However, if you are actually interested in the data, please read the thesis. This is how the flow through the studies was envisioned. Study 1 was just a test of the methodology to see if my ideas would work. It showed they will, or did, but obviously showed nothing else. Study 2 looked at the profiles of almost 200 master's students to determine if I could find an academic thinking style. Study 3 was the control group that used 8,200 profiles to test the hypotheses. Study 4 was investigated how self-aware the participants were, and then Study 5 tested their responses in a qualitative frame to show support for the hypotheses. Before going into the data of the 177 master students, I had to figure out what I thought the data would tell me. I wanted to know if there was a thinking style based on cognitive intentions or their combinations that would be common to all master students. I wanted to discover if certain cognitive intentions had more of an effect on student thinking. A factor analysis is a process in which the values of observed data are expressed as functions of a number of possible causes in order to find which are the most important. I wanted to know which cognitive intentions impacted the thinking quotient score derived from the identity compass profiles the greatest, and thus impacted the student's thinking in context. Unfortunately, the data told me nothing. The term to describe this meaninglessness is artifactual. The data were artifactual. However, what it did throw out in the factor analysis was a short list of cognitive intentions that could be considered, if not an academic thinking style, then a way of thinking within academia that is conducive to learning at master's level. So the results of the direct Oberlin rotation suggested that with many items having communalities higher than 0.4, there was a moderate correlation between the first and second components. And the fact that this combination is available to everyone is the reason why it's not an academic thinking style and simply one that is common to postgraduate students. For example, the first 2 cognitive intentions here on this slide would be expected to be seen in the student profile. Pause the video to read the slide. Due to the artifactual nature of the data in Study 2, I had to expand the objectives to take into account Study 3 and the 8,200 profiles. Would this number of profiles offer a positive result, given that I had hypothesized that people are not really aware of their use of cognitive intentions, and that this larger data set would offer some reification of the thinking quotient as a measure of self-awareness using cognitive intentions? The third study had over 8,200 profiles to interrogate. So I did another exploratory factor analysis. A few technical terms coming up now. Kaiser-Meyer-Orkin measure of sampling adequacy was equal to 0.94, which was higher than the recommended value of 0.6. Bartlett's test of sphericity was statistically significant. This all suggested that the data were overall appropriate for factor analysis. And the 5 factors explained 47.29% of the variance. Direct Oberlin rotation was used in order to get more accurate results, since some of the factors were correlated themselves. And the results of the multiple regression analysis were that the overall regression model was highly significant, explaining 20% of the variance of the thinking quotient, which might not sound like a lot, but of 8,000 profiles is quite high. All 5 cognitive dimensions predicted the TQ, the thinking quotient, at 1%. And I did this slide with help from my Sigma team at university, and the gentleman called Liam was very excited. I barely understood the principles at the time. And this is what came out. It demonstrated quantitatively that there is indeed a difference between the use of cognitive intentions at different levels of awareness, at the different levels of the thinking quotient. It's kind of obvious, but we needed to see the data to demonstrate this. So the factor analysis amounts to this idea. If you do those cognitive intentions in dimension 1, then you probably also do those ones in dimension 3 to a similar degree. A wonderful outcome of the factor analysis was that those cognitive intentions in factors 1 and 3 are opposing, as you can see from the arrows on the next slide. This is direct support for Piaget's disequilibrium idea, and that we do not grow in the status quo. We need to be disrupted in order to shock us out of our habituated thinking patterns. The important thing about the data here is that we now have quantitative support for adult thinking for Piaget's idea. The other awesome principle to emerge from the data in study 3 was that factors 4 and 5 map directly to Keegan's and Lasky's stages of adult development from a self and other perspective. If you practice those cognitive intentions in factor 4 too much, then you are stage 2, which isn't very high. But if you do factor 5, then you're stage 3 thinker, which is far too external, but it's a socialized mind. And if you're capable of balancing them, then you will rise up to stage 4 and beyond. This was an unforeseen outcome that delighted me. And this is what the factor analysis looks like in full color. Please notice the next arrows and how the opposing cognitive intentions map. So the results were that thinking styles exist, the TQ, the thinking quotient, exists, people's self-awareness can be measured, and we are essentially unaware of our self-awareness. If you want to see a bell curve, this falls in line with every other adult development tool in that the majority of the people fall roughly in the middle. The main difference being is that this model is quantitatively measurable. Essentially, I have made Keegan's work more robust. So if you now map the findings from study 2 to study 3, you can see the difference in how they think in the different contexts. If you have watched our other videos, you will know that our environment is our greatest intervention. Please understand that the labels for each stage are meaningless. Just like in any other system, it's simply a way of differentiating between the levels for use in our human systems. In CDT, the stage tells us the capacity of the individual, not the label. However, I had 2 more studies to do before I could say that this slide was useful. The data from study 3 showed that the hypotheses were supported. So from a quantitative perspective, my PhD was complete. However, I wanted to know if people actually did what the data said they did, and if they were using the cognitive intentions in the way the data showed. Did they really think in the ways the data outlined? Study 4 was to be the conduit between the data, quantitative, and the 5th study, which would be interviews, qualitative. In a nutshell, I wanted first to know if the participants knew they were constructing their thinking from a cognitive intention perspective, and then if they knew they used some specific cognitive intentions that the data said were important. I thought that this study would show us they did not know they were not aware of their thinking. There were more hypotheses, so please refer to the thesis for a fuller picture. In the questionnaire, I gave the participants a list of 13 cognitive intentions and described their meaning and use in a typical thinking style, as you can see in the red box here for the towards cognitive intention. I then asked the participants how much they thought they utilized, for example, global, in their thinking, using a slider scale from 0 to 100. I then mapped their response to their profile and attained a TQ score for their self-awareness for this study. The results on the slide are ranked by the participants' awareness of each cognitive intention. So, for example, internal is the one that everybody knew that they used, whereas global is the one they didn't know they used. There were 77 participants in this study. You can see the results here. Those who knew they were not self-aware at the bottom of the grid were correct. However, doesn't that mean that they were aware of their lack of awareness? Unlike those at the top of the grid who were not quite as aware as they thought they were. Lasky said that people at the lower levels didn't know they were lower level, And I'm sure you've heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is marginally different but an interesting parallel here. Basically, the participants roughly knew their level of awareness, which contradicts previous findings by other researchers. And based on the previous 4 quantitative studies, not only has the data supported the hypotheses emerging from the literature review and methodology, they also allowed new hypotheses to evolve from the findings. A semi-structured interview was designed to glimpse into the participants' lived experience of the above hypotheses in order to qualitatively investigate the data. I wanted the final study to tell me, qualitatively, if participants utilise the principles of constructive development as a framework within which they think and act. So from the 77 participants of study 4, I asked who would participate in my 5th study, and 10 people volunteered. This slide has their TQ score along with the self-report score derived from their cognitive intentional awareness from study 4. An interesting outcome of this study was the differentiation of those who were in therapy or recently had therapy versus those who were not. That will be a topic of a future research paper I will write for publication. The point of the 5th study was to ask the participants if they actually did what the data said they did. The themes that emerged were awareness of self and other, level 2 thinking from a Keegan perspective, level 3 thinking, which is Keegan's socialized mind. There were values-based responses, the direction of intention, which was quite important, estimation of self-awareness, and finally, specific questions for awareness and specific cognitive intention awareness, as per the list a few slides back. The interviews were an excellent way of teasing out levels of self-awareness based on the use of cognitive intentions and to provide support for CDT as a framework, which they did rather well. The net result of all 5 studies was that we could indeed deconstruct the adult development theories of Robert Keegan and Otto Lasky using cognitive intentions and point to a specific stage based on the combination of each. People are not aware of how they construct their thinking in the moment, but more importantly, people do construct their thinking using cognitive intentions. And finally, constructive development theory is a legitimate way of describing someone's level of self-awareness and its impact on their level of complex thinking, with a view to knowing what to change in order to grow them to the next level. How does the data demonstrate the theory is useful? On this slide, we can see a few of the claims made in the thesis that are made possible by the outcomes of the data in all 5 studies. Please pause the video to read the list if you wish. This concludes the very dry topic of research data supporting the theory. If you have made it this far, I am eternally grateful. If you would like to know more about how a direct Obermann rotation was used specifically, or just for a fuller understanding of how it all maps together, please point your camera at the QR code and it will take you to the thesis on my university servers. Thank you for listening and watching, and take care.